Good afternoon, and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Monica Maurer, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. After the presentation, we will have some time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you have difficulty hearing during the program, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers who will assist you. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming our Associate Director, Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Thank you, Monica, and good afternoon. Good afternoon. Well, and I hadn't seen somebody in a long time. Good afternoon. How are you? And welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics and the 2018 Elizabeth Dole Women in Leadership Lecture. But before I go with that, I would ask you to just turn to the back of your program and just remind you of our fall discussion groups. Very popular. If you have any time, 4 p.m. on Wednesdays, please join us. I'm sure you will find it as enjoyable as those that continue to come every week. Also, the Leavenworth series, very popular. And you can look at the title and know that if you happen to be available on Thursday, October the 4th, the Leavenworth series are, I cannot tell you how much you learn during those times, and the people who come have just raved about them. Better Angels, Can We Depolarize America? And that's another program that I would invite you to participate in. And also, we are starting our civic engagement and KU leadership activities programs and activities on campus. It goes from September the 30th to October the 19th. And today it started with the Backyard Bash, which was sponsored by the Spencer Museum. And the rest of it is voter registration, trying to make sure that our students not only register to vote, but they turn out to vote as well. With that, I'll continue with our program. We're very excited about it. And for those of you who were here yesterday, you know that Senator Elizabeth Dole and also Senator Dole were here as well. And this is part of the series named after Senator Elizabeth Dole. Today's interview will be conducted by our Institute Director, Bill Lacey, and our guests this afternoon are all involved in the field of military and veteran caregiver advocacy. Our first guest, Meg Kabat, currently serves as the National Director of the United States Department of Veterans Affairs Caregiver Support Program. In this role, Ms. Kabat serves as the Principal Advisor on family caregiving to senior leaders across Virginia. Robyn Loveland was selected as a fellow for the Elizabeth Dole Foundation in 2016, and she hails from Nebraska. A former lawyer, Loveland is a caregiver for her husband, Tad, a former combat engineer for the U.S. Army. Carolyn Tolliver-Lee was selected as a fellow for the Elizabeth Dole Foundation in 2017. She is the founder and organizer of the Veteran and Military Caregivers Support Network in Kansas, and is a caregiver for her friend Ernest, a former U.S. Army Scout. I would ask you to please join me in welcoming Ms. Kabat, Ms. Loveland, and Carolyn Tolliver-Lee. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out, and thank you, Meg, Carolyn, Robyn, for being part of this. Let's start, Meg, with you. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how you got involved with caregiving for military.
Sure. Well, my father served in Vietnam, which was before I was born, but it was a very important part of his life and something that we talked about on a regular basis. One of my earliest memories is actually running around in the backyard in May of 1975 when the conflict sort of officially ended and banging pots and pans. And my brother and I did that to celebrate. And we didn't really know what we were doing at the time, but we knew it was an important milestone for my father. And certainly there were many different things that were very important to my father based on his time in service. We were always on time. If we weren't on time, that was a very big deal. We got up early. There were things too that we always sat in the back of the room, or we sat, if we went to a movie, we sat in the back row. If we went to a restaurant, we sat against the sides. We didn't have balloons at parties because the loud noise really bothered him significantly, and no one ever really thought anything of that. Those were just things that we did in my family. And my grandfather, one grandfather had fought in World War II, and another had fought in World War I. And so the military was an important part of my family's history and story. And I never really thought about joining the military, but sort of knew I wanted to be in more of a helping profession, and ended up getting my social work degree. And really, sort of by happenstance and following different opportunities, ended up as a civilian working for the Navy. And that was back in 2003. And really sort of social work, we were talking earlier, social work is a pretty flexible degree. You can do lots of different things, work with lots of different kinds of people. And when I ended up at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, I sort of felt like I had found my spot, and really enjoyed the work that I was doing with active duty service members and their families. And obviously that was after September 11th, but there had been some combat, but not a lot of combat up until that point. But then as I stayed there, we were involved in more and more combat in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And so there started to be more and more seriously injured service members coming back to the hospital, and I got to work with a lot of their families, and really just sort of found my space, I guess. You know, we always try to find something that you're passionate about, and I found what I was passionate about. And, you know, there were always a lot of people coming to visit those wounded and spend time with them. And I watched over and over again wives and moms and dads sort of get pushed to the back of a room as, you know, all kinds of famous people and others were coming in. And also, you know, there was a lot of attention paid, a lot of nurses and doctors and specialists. And I was always the one sort of off to the corner, you know, holding the hand of that wife, or standing next to the mom explaining what was really going on. And so over time, the caregiving in the military started to gain a lot of traction on the Hill. There was some legislation passed, and I sort of fell into this role, and it's really been a blessing in many, many ways, because I've taken what I was able to do for one individual caregiver and do it for, you know, millions at this point. We know in VA, we actually know that about a quarter of all of the veterans that we serve report that they require assistance from someone else. So that's a pretty big number. Mm-hmm. And so we try really hard in VA, in my office, to talk about that, to educate doctors and nurses about how important that family caregiver is to making sure that that veteran can make a recovery or have a really solid quality of life, even if they can't recover.
Mm-hmm. How did you get your job at VA, and what exactly do you do there? Describe your job.
Okay, sure. I got my job really because because I've had a series of bosses who sort of dragged me with them as they moved up the chain of command, and really I got a phone call and someone said, I think you should take this job. And that's a lesson that I learned early on, to always be kind and thoughtful as you're switching jobs and other things because you never know where you're going to end up. And I think that's a pretty important thing. So VA is a huge integrated healthcare system, and we have over 150 hospitals across the country, and then we have another several hundred, even I think 1,000 or so smaller clinics across the country that are all have different amounts of health care, from inpatient hospitals to nursing homes to outpatient clinics. And so I work at headquarters, VA Central Office we call it, and I have a staff of 10 people, and we are in charge of the policy for a whole series of different caregiver support programs across the country. There are caregiver support coordinators who are nurses or social workers at every one of those medical centers across the country, and so we train them and we do a lot of national calls. And on top of that, I'm sort of the office or the face of the program on Capitol Hill and for the White House and on the political side. So I get to do things like testify in front of Congress, which is an interesting experience and not something I ever thought I would do when I first went to social work school, that's for sure. And I also get to do work with amazing partners like the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregiving, and other organizations like that.
Okay. Take a moment to describe the VA's efforts to support caregivers.
Excuse me. Sure. So really, sorry. He muted me while I was coughing. That was smart. VA's mission is really to support veterans, and certainly there have always been programs and resources that help family caregivers. Things like home health that actually is not available in a lot of other different kinds of insurance programs or health systems. But VA has always been able to provide services in the home for veterans who need that kind of service. And so in about 2010, there was this, a lot of talk about family caregiving in general, in part because our country is aging significantly, and so there's a lot of family caregiving going on everywhere. And then at the same time that was happening, there were more and more catastrophically injured service members coming back. And so there was a piece of legislation passed in 2010 that allowed VA to really expand the kinds of services that we provide. So we do a lot of different things. We have a lot of different training and education programs that we provide that are really in two different buckets. The first bucket is to help caregivers sort of with the tasks of caregiving. So how to take blood pressure, how to help transfer someone who can't get from a bed to a wheelchair, those kinds of things. The second bucket, which I almost think is more important, is sort of about the role of being a caregiver. Some people are sort of, and you'll probably hear some of this today, some people are sort of thrust into the role of being a caregiver. There was an injury, and one day someone is independent, and the next day they need a lot of help. But then there are others who sort of, it's not so obvious, and it takes a long time, especially in mental health issues and traumatic brain injury, where it's not clear that you actually are caregiving, and then eventually you realize that that's what you're doing. And then the program that we run that gets the most attention, if you will, if you Google Meg Kabat, the one that you'll see talked about in the press and things, is a program called the Program of Comprehensive Assistance. And this was really groundbreaking when it started back in 2011. And if a veteran meets certain eligibility requirements, their family caregiver can receive a stipend from VA because many caregivers have to leave their jobs in order to assist the veteran. And also health insurance if they don't have health insurance through a different mechanism. And partially that's because we have a lot of parents who are taking care of younger service members. And so they wouldn't qualify for some of the health insurance that's offered through the Department of Defense and those kinds of things. So that program right now, we serve about 20,000 veterans and their caregivers in that program. But under legislation that was just passed in June, that program is going to expand significantly over the next 4 or 5 years. So it's an exciting time to be in my role and really doing a lot of exciting things and offering services that we know are going well and are supportive to a much larger population.
Presumably, that'll let you serve a lot more veterans.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, very
Yeah.
good. Carolyn, Robyn, I want to ask the two of you a couple of questions. Carolyn, we'll start with you. Could you just tell everybody where you're from and a little bit about how you were raised?
Well, I'm originally from Long Island. Came to Kansas by way of the military. My late husband was stationed at Fort Riley. And what was your other question? That's where I'm from. What else?
Okay. And how you were raised?
How I was raised. Well, my father, oddly enough, was a World War II veteran, disabled veteran. He was blind all of my life. And we grew up as a family caring for him. I didn't realize how significant that was going to play in my life later on. That at one time I was taking care of my dad as a child, and then my late husband becomes disabled. And his children and me, both caring for him. Was raised in a family where our faith was really the center and the foundation of who we are and how we conducted our lives, which again, I didn't realize how significant a role that was going to play later, particularly when my late husband became ill. So somewhat of a close-knit family. We weren't raised around extended family because when my father left the military, he was discharged in New York at a small military base there, and his extended family lived in the South. But when he met my mother and they got married, they decided to stay there. Now, where do I know that story from? Okay. So my life kind of, for the first time I realized it, kind of paralleled theirs. So yeah, that was kind of my life. 6 siblings, 2-parent home, father 100% and totally disabled. My mother took care of him. She may have worked outside the home only if she wanted to. Nothing serious, no career. Very much a homemaker. Very involved in the lives of her children. She was my Girl Scout leader, and, we were very involved in our local church, and so was my father. Although he was blind, he was very much a gospel singer, if you all are familiar with gospel music. And we would just, typical family. The difference between probably my parents and my friends' parents is that my friends' mothers and father worked. My mother wasn't able to work because she cared for my father. But that was normal for us.
Mm-hmm.
It was normal. The fact that my father didn't have any sight did not diminish our love and respect for him as our dad. So it had no bearing on our household and being a family. And honestly, Bill, I only realized that maybe 10 years ago. But, and I talked to my sons, and they somewhat have the same opinion about growing up with their father being disabled. It just really didn't have a great bearing for them being sons until they became men. And I have one son that's in the military, and he often tells me, I wish I could talk to my dad about his Army life. But when his dad was alive, he was basically nonverbal.
Mm.
So that's when it really became significant, when they became men.
Okay. Robyn, tell us a little bit about your family and upbringing.
Let's see. Well, I currently live in Nebraska, but I was born and raised in North Dakota, a rural community, relatively small, about 18,000 people. And unlike Carolyn, my family, my father was in the Vietnam, was a Vietnam veteran, but never spoke about it. I mean, I can remember maybe 3 conversations his entire life that we ever had about that. And as I grew up, I knew nothing about the military. I wasn't located anywhere near a base. My first exposure to military life with my husband was when I was 40. So it was pretty foreign to me, to be honest. I grew up in North Dakota, went straight off to undergraduate and got my degree from Creighton University in Omaha, and then went on to later get my law degree from Creighton as well. And I practiced law for a long time. But I guess as we were discussing, the same thing occurs to me now, that the real reason that I got my law degree was maybe not necessarily what I did for all those years, but what I can do now to advocate for my husband and other veterans and family members and people that we know. So that's kind of the road I took. A little different.
Can the two of you, and I'm not going to call on either of you to necessarily jump in first, so somebody just jump in. How did you become a caregiver, and what does that entail on a daily basis?
You start? All right. Let's see. When did I become a caregiver? I think when Meg was talking about how some are gradual, some are immediate. Our experience was not immediate. My husband was in the Army for 22 years. And over the course of his exposure, he cleared bombs off the roads, is the easiest way to say it. So lots of concussive over the course of 22 years, concussions. And it wasn't real clear to me at first. When he first moved to Omaha, the first inkling I got that there was any sort of issue whatsoever was that he was on 12 different medications. And I remember going to the first appointment with him, which, by the way, when we walked in, we sat down, and when the doctor came in, she asked me to leave. And I was taken a little bit aback. I was surprised. I thought, I don't really understand. I mean, this has never, kind of happened. And I just said, if he wants me to leave, I'll happily do that, but I'd like to stay. And she left. I guess they had some sort of conference, came back and allowed me to stay. But over the course of it, we were able to work with the VA to, well, largely my husband's work, to get him from 12 different medications to probably around 2 now. And it was a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of communication with your providers and communication with between me and my husband about things like that. And so I didn't even realize at that point I was a caregiver. I'm just walking this road with him. I think the day that I realized it, we were supposed to meet, I was working, and we were supposed to meet for pizza at his favorite pizza place. It's a place called Pitch in Omaha, and he loves it. And as you were saying, Meg, he was a half an hour late, and he's military. There's no way. I mean, this just doesn't happen. If we're 10 minutes early, we're still late. That's just his thing. So I wasn't prepared for this, and I called him on the phone, and when I reached him, I could hear it in his voice. He was afraid, and I'd never heard that before. And I said, hey, babe, where are you? And he was across town in a parking lot, sitting in a parking lot. He had no idea where he was. I had to kind of walk him through, okay, tell me the landmarks, where, I'm in a parking lot, it's a Walmart, okay, and we had to walk through this whole thing, and I hung up the phone, and as he was going to drive down to meet me, and I hung up the phone, and it just occurred to me, oh boy, I think I need to quit my job. And that was the moment, I guess, for me.
Okay, Carolyn?
I appreciate you going first.
You're welcome.
Okay, for me, the year was 1988. The year was 1988. My husband at that time was complaining of headaches. My head hurts, my head hurts, my head hurts. And his unit was getting ready to deploy, because he was active duty, to the first Gulf War. And 3 days, I think it was, before his unit deployed, he started having convulsions, epileptic seizures. So he was on a non-deployable status. And in Kansas, as you probably well know, once you have a seizure, you cannot drive for at least 6 months. So me having to drive him around and drive everyone in the family, my son, who's here today, he was just a year old at that time. And I saw then it became on gradual, like she said. He was now having limitations. He was having difficulty recalling various things. He was frustrated, maybe even angry, because now he had to depend on me to take him to various places, something that he as a man and him as a soldier did not feel comfortable with. He went into a big depression as he became very limited on what he could do. And that just progressed over the years. More limitations he had. There were times he couldn't speak. Forgetfulness. One summer day, the kids were home. He was home. He was cooking breakfast for the kids and forgot that he was cooking and jumped in the shower. The kids were downstairs playing. They run upstairs. They realized the kitchen's on fire, and they had to take care of it. Then I get a lady from work saying, "Don't you live on Caroline? Because I just saw a bunch of fire trucks at your house." I'm like, "What?" So I dashed home from work. All of this was gradual. So at that time, we realized he could not be left alone. Eventually, the Army medically discharged him permanently. And when he got his discharge papers, he said to me, he says, "Whatever I have is not curable. And these Army doctors are giving me all this medicine that they don't even know if it's going to work." And he was scared. He was really scared because he had never been so dependent on another person. He was scared because he was wondering how he was going to take care of his family. He was always a very good provider. And he was scared because he had never been sick before. He was always a fairly healthy man. And when he did get to that state, it changed his entire personality. And I knew then that he was going to have to be someone that my sons and I were going to have to take care of.
Okay. I have a number of questions that are for all three of you, so whoever wants to answer first, please just jump in. Speak to why, to how you found out about the Elizabeth Dole Foundation.
I'll go first on that one,
Okay.
because I thought about that question last night. I work on Fort Riley, like I mentioned to you. And, you know, when women get together, we talk about husbands and kids and meals, whatever. And so we have a volunteer at the place where I worked, and she asked me, so what does your husband do? I said, well, my husband's been medically discharged. She said, oh, are you a part of the Elizabeth Dole Foundation? I'm like, no, I'm not. What is this? So it was actually a volunteer in my workplace that told me about it. She gave me the website, we got on the computer, and we read it, and I was like, man, I really need this. I needed this. I needed it because I lived in a community at that time, even though it's an integrated military community. During that time when he was discharged in the late 80s, early 90s, all of the programs that the military families have now were not available. So when he left, we were really figuring it out on our own. We didn't have a lot of guidance from the military or from the VA. So when I found this website, I felt like I hit the jackpot because I was feeling very alone in my own community. I sat in a church of hundreds of people and I still felt alone because I didn't know if anybody else who was caring for their disabled vet. I looked in the sanctuary and I saw husbands and wives sitting together. My husband couldn't sit in church anymore. African American churches are very loud. And he couldn't take all that overstimulation. He's even had seizures while sitting in the congregation, so we was like, we can't do this anymore. So it became a challenge, a very serious challenge with his condition. I used to live in denial and say, this was his condition, I'm helping you through your condition. You're the one who was discharged from the military. But then later on, I learned that my sons and I, although he was diagnosed with PTSD, we probably had a diagnosis of secondary PTSD.
Okay.
Well, I can sort of tell my story about the first time I met Senator Dole. Back in the summer of 2011, we were launching this program. There was a lot of attention being paid to how VA was rolling out the program and what we were doing. And in the middle of all of this, we got an email that said that myself and my boss, an amazing woman named Debbie Amder, were to meet with Senator Elizabeth Dole. And I thought, oh my goodness, what are we going to talk to her about? And so we went to the Watergate, which in itself is kind of a cool experience because there's a lot of history around the Watergate. And we went up into an office, and it was set with beautiful china and cookies. And the whole time we were talking to Senator Dole about what we were doing in VA to support caregivers, she kept asking us, making sure we were eating the cookies. And it was just a really, from professionally, an amazing experience. And at the time, she was trying to figure out, how to frame this and she wanted to figure out what the gap was. She knew that there was a gap, but what's the gap? And she knew that there were services being provided and things like that, but it seemed as though it wasn't very coordinated, and so she really asked a lot of very thoughtful questions, and out of that, was born sort of the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, and I've been very lucky to sort of be a witness to it as it evolved over time. And in VA, we always have competing priorities. There are always a million things going on that we're trying to fix all at once. Early on, when we were rolling out the program, I had one of our caregiver support coordinators tell me that she had met with a medical center director, her boss's boss's boss, to talk about the caregiver support program at their medical center. And the medical center director said, I'm in the middle of dealing with veteran homelessness. We can't take on another thing like this. And I really took that to heart. It was, I think, an important message for me at that time, that just because I was sitting in Washington, D.C. telling people they had to do this, that there wasn't necessarily, and because I knew it was the right thing to do, it wasn't necessarily something that was going to occur easily or quickly throughout our entire medical system. And so, Senator Dole has been right there every time we get a new secretary, which has been a lot over the past couple of years. She's there meeting with that person saying, are you supporting Meg? Are you supporting Meg's office? This is what I need you to do for me. And so, she has kept a big spotlight on families and caregivers, and it's really, I think, benefited the entire program, because we don't hide under the radar at all. We're one of the important things, and I credit her with a lot of that as well. So it's my relationship to the Elizabeth Dole Foundation is so vital and so important to keep everyone focused on how important this mission is.
Mhm. Robyn, how did you hear first about the Elizabeth Dole Foundation?
Oh, it was actually the outgoing Nebraska fellow was a client of mine. I was a case manager for her at a nonprofit. And one day she called me and said, hey, we need a replacement in Nebraska for the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. And I knew of it, but not much. And so after we got off the phone, I did some research online and looked it up and thought about it, and was honestly really excited to have the opportunity to do more advocacy again. I had been missing that since not practicing law, and I called her back and said, I am absolutely on board. How do I sign up, and how fast can I do it? And I went through the process and was really grateful to be chosen.
Okay. Meg just described a little bit her first meeting with Elizabeth Dole. I'd like Carolyn and Robyn to address. When did you first meet Elizabeth Dole, and what were your thoughts?
I met her 3 years ago. I live in Manhattan, Kansas. And after the young lady had introduced me to the website, and after we went through the process, and actually it was before I got selected as a fellow, I was having some concerns with the VA. And when I learned about, let me back up. When I learned about the Elizabeth Dole Military Caregivers, I visited this website. At the same time, I was having some discontentment with the VA regarding my husband. And so I was like, now this is where I can really get my concerns heard. So I brought it to the attention of the liaison, the military liaison in Manhattan, and she had arranged for me to speak a Tuesday evening at the city commissioners meeting in Manhattan. And I was telling them about the challenges my husband was having at that time, and how I was very discontent with the VA. And there were 3 soldiers sitting in the back row listening to what I was talking about. And before I took my seat, I said, and I learned that there's an Elizabeth Dole Foundation who could help people like me with situations such as what I'm experiencing with my veteran. And I said, I wish I could go, but this conference is going to be held like in 2 weeks. There is no way I can afford to purchase a ticket to Washington, D.C. in 2 weeks, plus hotel expenses. I said, but I so feel like this is where I need to be to make my concerns known. The next day I get a call at work, and city commissioner, the liaison person, says, Carolyn, do you remember those 3 soldiers that were at the commissioners meeting last night? I don't know who they are. Even to this day, I don't know who they were. They said, they want to sponsor you. I said, oh my God. I mean, like, tickets gonna have to be purchased like in 10 days. And she said, yeah, what they want you to do is get your flight information and give them a cost of your hotel, the whole trip. I just would have to be responsible for my food. I could do that. And 3 soldiers sponsored me the very first time I went to Washington, D.C. I don't know who they are to this day, but I did buy them a souvenir and take it back over to the city commissioners meeting. I said, I don't know who the soldiers are. You know, please give them these gifts for me and tell them how much I appreciate it. Because out of that brief meeting, the needs that I went there for were met. I stood up in a room of nearly 600 other military caregivers, and the Secretary of Veterans Affairs was there. At that time, it was Robert McDonald. And they said, anybody in the room have any questions? And I raised my hand and came over and I told them, I said, more or less, you've kept your promise to take care of my veteran. He's 100% and totally disabled. Traumatic brain injury, PTSD. You've kept your promise. But you've taken this veteran and you've placed him in a nursing home, which is ill-equipped to care for his diagnosis. I think this veteran and others like him deserve far better. And I'm holding you responsible. Ironically enough, the director of polytrauma affairs at Walter Reed, he was also there. And so Mr. McDonald tells the doctor, get with Miss Lee on the break. And I'm like, okay. So the doctor gets off of the panel, he comes over to me, he hands me his card, and he says, we'll talk when we both get back home. I'm like, okay, I'll probably never hear from him again. But he did call me, and what he wanted to know was more about Mr. Lee's diagnosis. And of course, him working already at Walter Reed, he can have access to his medical records, but he needed his Social Security number. And I said, yes, I'll give you that. This was like March or something. And so he says, let me see what I could do. Let me review his records and see what I could do. So he calls me back in about 3 months and he says, we've got the perfect facility that can probably better care for your husband, but it's in St. Louis. He says, but when I talked to the VA in Topeka and the VA in Leavenworth and Kansas City, all of which he had received care at, they would say, I don't think it's a good idea to send him there because these facilities have told us you and your sons visit him frequently. And I don't think he would do very well if he didn't see you all as often as he's accustomed to seeing you. I said, well, I kind of agree with that, so what's plan B? He said, but I got another offer. He said, there's a facility in Manhattan called Meadowlark Hills. Anyone here familiar with that? And he says, they have a dementia unit. He said, perhaps that would be a good facility for your husband. I'm like, yes, this is perfect. That's only 2 blocks away from where I live. Let's go for it. He says, but there's one problem. They don't accept veterans. And so I said, and? He said, would you like for me to petition them, do the application process for them to consider to start taking veterans? So yeah, that's in walking distance. Me and my sons, we can do that. So I say, okay, it's probably be a year process, 2 years process, right? It took 90 days. 90 days, he called me back. And he says, go check the facility out, see if this is indeed a place you want Mr. Lee to go. They have agreed to accept veterans. And I said, yes, that trip to DC was worth it. But that's not the rest of the story. They looked at his medical records, and because of, I don't know if you're familiar with PTSD or traumatic brain injury, they're very difficult patients, very, extremely difficult patients. So they said, well, if the current nursing home can get him stabilized, if the VA can get him stabilized on the medicine to help reduce a lot of his aggression and agitation, we would consider it, because you live so close, he's a veteran, we want to help our veterans in our community. So I said, okay. So I told the nursing home what they had to do. We were going to work together. I explained to Mr. Lee, my husband, although he was nonverbal, he could comprehend very well. And I believe he was even excited with the idea of coming to Manhattan, because at that time he was 2 hours away from us. So having him closer would have made him real excited. So they had to collect his records for at least 3 to 6 months to show a lot of his aggression had been reduced, and that they had more or less gotten him stable. But that didn't happen. You want to know the rest of it? He passed away. But they accept veterans today. They accept veterans today. And they never did up until I got sponsored and made it known at the Elizabeth Dole conference. And that's what I'm most proud of. Although he could not take advantage of it, some strange soldiers sponsored me to go up there to advocate for him, and he never benefited from it, but other soldiers today do.
Okay, thank you. Robyn, how did you meet Elizabeth Dole?
Well, before I was to go to DC for the annual meeting, where we call it Storming the Hill, before I was to go meet for that, the foundation called me and asked if I would like to participate in a collaborative effort with the ABA, with the American Bar Association, to work on getting more services available to veteran populations. And so the ABA and the Elizabeth Dole Foundation sponsored me to go there for that. And she ended up being at the luncheon, excuse me, and spoke at that luncheon. And so I don't know if y'all really know how much she does. I mean, she does work, again, excuse me, in the caregiving community, but she also is very active in all aspects of veteran health and care and caregiver health and care and wellness. As shown by that, I mean, that was a phenomenal conference, and I think we made a lot of inroads into helping veterans access legal help, which is a real difficult issue as well. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. Take a
I know, I
sip
gotta-
of water there. So, yeah. Okay. I'd like all three of you to just give your thoughts, and I think I know the answer to this, but I want to hear what you have to say. Why did Elizabeth Dole get involved in this?
Her husband.
Share a little more.
Yeah.
Oh, the short story, I think, is when her husband, Robert Dole, Senator Robert Dole, was hospitalized at one time, she noticed that other spouses were coming in to Walter Reed to visit their soldier, their veteran. And she said the way that she believed best that she could reach out to them, because she already see that they shared something in common, she said she's decided to go home and bake some chocolate chip cookies. Did she tell you that? Oh, you
No,
know about the
no,
chocolate
I
chip
never
cookies?
heard about the chocolate
You heard
chip
about the
cookies,
chocolate,
so.
yeah. She
I know
went-
Senator Bob Dole is a big fan of cookies.
Oh,
so-
okay, okay. So she said she went home and she baked some chocolate chip cookies, And then the next day, she would go around and offer them that, and that was the icebreaker for them to have conversation. And then she realized, we have a lot more in common than we don't. And she thought that if they could be a support to each other, then that would make their caregiving journey a lot easier and a lot lighter. And she saw the need. She saw spouses there at a bedside, day after day, hour after hour, and she's wondering, imagine what their lives is when they're not here in the hospital. And how much help do they have, with raising their children or just managing their house when they have a person who's ill, probably indefinitely. But she said it all started with baking a batch of chocolate chip cookies and offering it to them just to learn more about their lives as they were caring for their veteran. That was kind of the short story, right?
Yeah. Well, and she was very methodical about and thoughtful about what to do about it and how to be supportive. And so as I told my story, she met with us and I know she met with a lot of different folks to get a sense of what the landscape was like already out there so that she wasn't just duplicating something that already existed. And as I've heard her talk about many times since, as she did with other really difficult issues that she faced in her public career, she wanted to make sure there was some data, so she commissioned RAND to do a study called now Hidden Heroes, and which was really sort of the first comprehensive study of caregiving in the military space. And that really laid a foundation for sort of the underpinnings of what the foundation would really do. And the Fellows program really came out of that because it was evident that really to make, and she has amazing stories about seatbelts. I don't know if people have heard her stories about how, she's like pretty much single-handedly responsible for people wearing seatbelts. And the first time I heard her share that story, to me, it was just something to aspire to. To think about how much time and energy and effort I put into my kids and their car seats and them wearing seatbelts, and how many millions of people's lives have been saved because she figured out a way to get everyone to wear a seatbelt. I can't let that go by without when I talk about Senator Dole, because to me it's just incredible. But she, in that same way, she knew that anecdotes were just as powerful as the data, and you can't get anywhere if you don't have both. And that's the way to convince, it was the way she convinced Ronald Reagan to push forward with mandatory seatbelts, and it was the way that she was going to get the country to move on supporting military caregivers. And so I think the Fellows program is really the anecdote side of that, and having people share their stories, and they're very different stories, and with communities around the country, and then having the data piece behind it and the advocacy behind that has really helped.
If I can add something to that.
Sure.
Going back to the RAND Corporation, the RAND Corporation report, can you hear me? The
Can
RAND
now.
Corporation reported that there were 5.5 million military and veteran caregivers across our country. That's a huge number. And this report was published in 2014. So here it is 4 years later, almost 5 years later. I can only imagine what those numbers are. And the people that she surveyed, or that they surveyed, all had different stories to tell of how they became caregivers, what their care recipient needs are, what their family needs are. Many of them have quit their jobs to stay home and care for their veteran. I always say, working for Fort Riley, I couldn't work anywhere else while he was alive because they got it. And the people I worked with at Fort Riley, they understood. The colonel of that base, the general of the base, knew that there was a Mr. Lee that needed care because of his service to the United States Army. So if I got an emergency call at work, there was no ifs, ands, or qualms about it. I could rush to his bedside, and they got it. So that was the best thing for me. I was one of those caregivers that did not have to quit my job, you know, but I was there enough to know that I was going to be concerned and make sure that he was taken care of. But working for Fort Riley allowed me to do that. I was very fortunate because many caregivers don't have that luxury, if you will, that their employer understands what their commitment is to a disabled veteran. But Fort Riley got it.
And I think Elizabeth Dole got it in a even deeper sense. Over the past few years that I've been with the foundation, two words strike out to me when I think about Elizabeth Dole and the process that she's gone through in supporting this community that I'm a part of. And I think it's innovative and intuitive. And the reason that I think it's those things is because it takes so much to know what to do with a massive problem. And you've got to be innovative. And then you have to be intuitive enough to know what is it going to take as this grows. And I have no doubt whatsoever that the foundation and that she will always be a step ahead of the curve with this. She will always have the ideas that are needed at just the right time. And I feel grateful for that. And it's something that has impacted my life and my family's life to such a degree that I can't even express. So I'm very grateful for her intuitive nature and the way that she foresees what we need.
Robyn and Carolyn, could you speak to how you were selected as Dole Fellows and what your responsibilities as a Dole Foundation Fellow are?
Well, there is an application process. We had to have reference letters. I remember my supervisor had to fill out an application, which is more or less a reference letter. I think there were two required.
Two.
Yeah,
I
two
think
reference letters. And part of our job or our responsibility is very much what we're doing here today, representing the hidden heroes, the other hidden heroes, sharing our story, letting the communities know that hidden heroes don't want to be hidden because there are different services and support that hidden heroes need in your community. So we get out and do a lot of public speaking, and that's kind of the requirement, to let people know you may have hidden heroes in your community that may need your help or services so they can take care of their veteran and take care of their families, and they need your support. So we want to make sure those people are recognized and that their needs are met. So we have to talk. I speak in churches. I have done radio spots. I speak on the base where I work. Just letting them know being a part of the Hidden Heroes is much bigger than what I thought it was going to be. And like I shared with you that day, I stood in that room of 600 other caregivers. I was so grateful because I felt like I am not alone. People on my street didn't even know what my life was like because either I was at work or at the hospital, at the nursing home. They didn't even know, but she brought it all to the surface so we could help one another and be recognized, and if you don't mind me saying, being respected for what we do for taking care of our veterans and our families. And she made that happen, because otherwise we would still be hidden.
I think there was also an interview. There was, we had a one-on-one interview via Skype, I think, at the time, with someone that was in charge, I guess, at the foundation. I don't remember it right now. But I think also one of the other important aspects of what we do is what I spoke about a little earlier, and that was we storm the Hill. And so all of us come together in mass on a week during November. November is coming, yeah. And because she has such influence, and because no one says no to her, you know, we have meetings with senators and representatives in our various states all at once, and we bring a voice as a community. And I don't know how you could do it better than that. I don't know how you could reach the individuals in Congress who make the decisions that are driving all of these policies without coming together with one voice. And she makes that possible through the foundation. And she, again, was intuitive and innovative enough to understand how helpful that would be. And so I think it's a great process. It's scary. I will say the first year I went, I was terrified. I was sitting outside my senator's, office and in the chair, and I thought, I can't breathe. How am I going to speak? And but we had a lot of training. She does some really good training, so you just sit back and rely on your training and know you can do this. And you know that, like you said, there are a lot of hidden heroes right behind you who are needing you to do that. And so as hard as it is sometimes to sit up here and talk about your experience or to go there to the Hill, I think the foundation and Elizabeth Dole has inspired us enough to understand that it's really important work. And I'm glad to have something that I can put my heart and soul into again. I love caring for my husband. I love spending time with him. I love being with him. But again, it gave me an outlet to support others and to do advocacy that I think is really important.
Okay, for all three of you, what are the primary challenges that caregivers face? Don't everybody jump in and say that.
Well, I'll give a research perspective, because we've
Great.
done some research, right? So we'll try to do some data and some anecdotes, right? So one of the things that caregivers really talk about a lot is respite. And so respite is basically taking a break, and how challenging it is to take a break. And, even a short break. And you heard a couple of stories about feeling like you couldn't leave the veteran you're caring for home alone. And so you can imagine the pressure around that if you have to go to a meeting at your child's school, or you want to get your hair cut, and how challenging that can be. And so respite is it's almost, if it's not something that you're hearing people talk about, it will be in the near future, because as our country ages, it's going to become more and more of an issue for the military population as well as the general population. And just finding skilled individuals to come and spend time with people who can't be left alone for cognitive reasons or because of physical reasons. So that is a huge challenge. And then in the younger caregiver space, folks who aren't so established, who didn't have long careers before they had to leave the military, financial assistance is a huge challenge, because people have to leave their jobs. And the compensation that they get from VA or DOD is often not enough to sustain a family that's raising children and everything else without a second income. So that is a huge challenge that's reported by many different younger families as well.
There was a time when Mr. Lee lived at home. First, I want to tell you, he lived almost the last 20 years of his life in a nursing home. That's a long time. And when he lived at home, we worked it out as a family. And then he went to go live in an institution. And some people will think, well, he doesn't live at home, so you guys got it made. That was not the case. That was not the case. Regarding my family, I would say my challenges was me staying healthy. And data does show that the caregiver's health also can be threatened. I've had many strokes. I have had the shingles. I have had chronic nosebleeds. I have had headaches, backaches, all related to stress. And that comes from years and years of phone calls. Hello, Mrs. Lee, we found Mr. Lee on the floor. Hello, Mrs. Lee, Mr. Lee has pulled out his feeding tube today. Hello, Mrs. Lee, Mr. Lee is refusing to eat. Hello, Mrs. Lee, Mr. Lee's not taking his medicine. Hello, Mrs. Lee, Mr. Lee is sitting in his room crying. 30 years. 30 years, that's what it was of my life and my children's life. So it was our health that could have been compromised. When I had a stroke, I had it at the nursing home. And they rushed me to the hospital, and the nurse says, Miss Lee, is that you? I'm like, yeah, can you believe this? Well, he was just there in ICU the week before. Your health can become compromised, and the data will show that. But making sure that he was taken care of and got what he needed. He was nonverbal, like I said. I had to be his voice. And I held every institution that ever cared for him responsible. You will take care of this vet, because him and everybody else deserves it. You will take care of these vets. I knew all his nurses by first names. They got Christmas cards and candies and stuff like that for me, because I know it was a tough job. But it was tough for all of us. So I would say the challenge was caregivers' health.
Okay. Robyn?
I think for me, the biggest challenge has been accepting it's a marathon and not a sprint. And it's kind of what she's talking about. And accepting that as a family, that you know that your life is forever changed, but you want to make it the best life you possibly can. And so my goal is always that he remain as independent as possible for as long as possible. And that's a marathon. And sometimes I'm naggy. He will say, when I first wanted him to do yoga, that's my when he was on 12 different medications, I was like, baby, let's try yoga. I mean, really, it does so much good. And you can imagine this big, burly, Army guy and what he had to say to me about that, which I can't repeat. But he did say, fine, at one point. And he went to a class with me, and I will never forget walking out of class and just seeing the peace on his face. You could see it. And he said, okay, I get it. And so he became a yoga instructor. We went to class together, we trained together, he became certified. He went the whole 9 yards, because that's the kind of guy he is, though, too. He'll try anything. He will. He'll try anything. He says, I Charlie Browned him to death, to do it, wah, 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 you keep talking about it. So for me, the challenge is to keep finding those things for him, because the road's long, and every time we feel stable, it becomes unstable. And you know that, and you can accept that, but finding the best quality care, the best programs, the best treatment options, the best medication sometimes. I mean, sometimes it is medication that he needs. Being able to find all these things and knowing you're going to have to keep doing that for 20, 30, hopefully, God willing, 50 years. who knows, right? And that's a challenge. I think that's my challenge.
Okay, I have one final question, then we'll open it up to your questions and answers. And sorry, I've run a little bit longer than I normally do tonight because I find this subject just absolutely fascinating. But can all of you address what we as individuals and what the United States as a country, what more can be done for caregivers?
Oh, I can speak to that right now. I have had the hardest time trying to transition back to some kind of, employment. And so it's very difficult when you talk to companies about wanting to work from home. And my mind is boggled by this concept because so many people do work from home and you hear so many stories. And so I think the population, if people would be a little more understanding in corporate positions to the needs of caregivers and accommodate them, I think they'll find us to be some of the most incredible employees and hardest workers you'll find. I think that's one thing I would say.
Anybody else?
Well, I think that one of the things that needs to shift dramatically, and I would say this is true of healthcare across the country, is that if we talk a lot about moving to patient-centered care, where in VA we talk about veteran-centered care, and we need to be much more inclusive of families in healthcare, and that needs to happen across the spectrum in lots of different ways. Families should not be kicked out of rooms, as Robyn shared her story. Obviously, if there's a reason why, that's one thing, but in general, yeah.
And it really is. It's an education.
Yeah, it's an education thing. But I think as a country around healthcare, we need to be much more inclusive of families and much more understanding that most healthcare actually occurs at home, right? I mean, the amount of time that a physician or a nurse or even a physical or occupational therapist spends with a patient is minimal. What really, the wellness piece of it is what happens outside of that. So we need to shift as a whole country.
Yeah, I like that idea.
We'll make it happen, Jay.
Okay. Although I'm no longer caregiving, my journey ended last year. But as Meg was talking, I was visualizing when we say bring the hidden heroes to the surface, people know and recognize and support their hidden heroes in their communities. And that could be respite care, or in my case with Mr. Lee, going to the nursing homes, knowing where they are. One thing I always stayed a little bit upset with is when he had to move out of the VA setting into the community setting, because when he was in the VA, he got so much support from different organizations there at the VA that lived, organizations in Topeka that supported and remembered their veterans. You know, the Girl Scouts come up and they sing Christmas carols to them, or at K-State, no offense to anybody here who's K-State, but when he was in a nursing home in Manhattan, Bill Snyder's players would go up and see the vets and, give them signed autographs. These are the same boys that they lay in bed watching on television. So I think the community needs to reach out more to them. And that will help that family if they have other visitors and other support from their community. It doesn't take a whole lot. Veterans are old soldiers. It don't take much for them. But just to know that you can stop by and check on one or two on a regular basis, that would be awesome. That'll make that veteran really happy. They get that, at least our experience, when he lived in the VA. I mean, Domino's Pizza would deliver 50 pizzas a month just to say thank you to the vets. And they got that recognition. But when they get tucked away in the community, sometimes they're forgotten there. And so are their families. So I would think ideally if people could pay attention and remember that these veterans are at home, they are tucked away with their caregivers, and it should be more of a collaborative effort and not just all on the caregiver, whether they're at home or whether they live in an institution. Reach out to them.
Okay, we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. One of our student workers with a microphone will come by and then ask one question, please.
Thank you for sharing with us this afternoon. Bill, I'm ignorant about this program. Are there more than one fellow per state? Are there fellows in every state? Tell us a little bit more about the program.
Oh,
Okay.
Look at you.
Okay. Pretty much every state, I think, has one. Some states have more. I think they try to kind of work it on a like number of veterans per state type of analysis.
I believe Kansas has 2, and we serve for 3 years or 2 years?
2.
2-year commitment, and that's part of our agreement, you know, with the application process. And I believe the other fellow for Kansas is in Fort Leavenworth area. I think he or she is in Fort Leavenworth area. And they are too supposed to be out in the community making the program very visible and the radius and where they live.
You can get online to, excuse me?
Are you compensated in any way?
No.
No.
But you can get online on the website, and you can see every single one of us in every state. There's a little bio on us and who we are, where we live, that kind of thing. Some states are missing just because they're rural, and it's hard to find somebody that will come, you know, and serve in that function. I know Nebraska only has me, and we couldn't find anyone to take my place this year. So technically Nebraska has no one, so I just keep going, you know. But you'll find that on the website too. It'll
Right.
give you a nice,
And like she just mentioned, if you go visit the Elizabeth Dole Foundation or Hidden Heroes, each of our stories are out there, a short bio.
Okay, other questions? I know there have to be some more questions. We have one right here.
Hi. Meg, this is a question for you. I just wonder how you battle the challenge of the enormous bureaucracy of the VA in moving this program forward, the program that you're working on, and how you battle the negative publicity that's always out there about VA, and hearing the families' frustrations with VA services.
So, you know, the negative publicity is, it's a real challenge. But I will say that for every negative story, I can share a whole bunch of really positive stories. And so, you know, I know a lot of people who work in VA who are not in it for the money, who are definitely in it because they are devoted and dedicated. And, you know, the physician that Carolyn talked about is a good friend of mine, and I know that he, you know, he's doing that for Carolyn, and he's doing it for many other people as well. So, you know, I've developed thick skin. I mean, I really have. I mean, you know, and I have a great family. I mean, I have an amazing husband and 2 amazing kids who keep me resilient and don't let me come home and be miserable. So that's important as well. My own respite. It is challenging. I actually told them both earlier that part of my challenge is that I only hear the really bad stuff. You know, a lot of times when I talk to caregivers, it's caregivers who are really angry about something that's going on at their particular medical center or with their particular situation. And so you start to think that everything is a disaster. And that's hard to balance. And so I love going out to medical centers, or the Elizabeth Dole Foundation has done some different events around the country. And so I was in Boston a couple months ago. And so those are good moments where I see positive things that are happening. So it is a challenge. And, you know, I mean, I was interviewed on NPR, and it was funny because I heard by the time it was on Morning Edition, and by the time I got to work, I heard from people on, you know, Facebook and LinkedIn and other places that I had not heard from in like a decade, friends from high school and things. And first of all, I had no idea that so many people listened to Morning Edition, so that's important to know. And but, you know, it's interesting because most of them had no idea what I was talking about. They didn't, you know, and so here I am thinking, oh, I'm going to get fired. This is huge. This is a disaster. You know, this program is a mess. What are we going to do? And, you know, to this sort of general public out there, it's, you know, it's one more story. So even though it feels sort of personal, you have to figure out how to distance yourself, or I couldn't stay in it. And I feel very devoted, and I need to be able to stay in it. So I appreciate your question.
Okay. Other questions? Any more hands? Oh, got one back here.
I want to thank all three of you very much. This is really enlightening, and I'll just say thank you. When you talk about the veterans, is there any difference for many in terms of caring for male veterans versus women veterans? And are they treated like the same?
I can probably touch on that. I have a good friend, Jason, who is out in Boston, and he cares for his wife. And he's the same age as I am. Our kids are the same age. Our spouses have similar injuries. And I will say, I think it's more difficult for him by far, probably because there's not as much of a community for the male caregivers out there. And honestly, I have been in error before about saying she or using the female, you know, terminology when I'm talking about things. And I'm very careful about that now. And I think it's hard for them. To find that tribe, as we call it, that you're part of. And I think as far as they're concerned, they feel comfortable with all of us, and we all, you know, have a very good camaraderie, I guess. But I do know that it depends on the era as well. For a long time before the passage of the new caregiver, the Mission Act, his wife wasn't included in the program. So I was included in the program, and he was not. And that was really difficult. You know, the services that I was able to receive and the help that I was getting, when he had questions or problems or issues, I couldn't say, well, just do this or go here, because they weren't available to him. So I guess that's my answer to that.
Jason said that oftentimes, when he would take his wife to the VA, more times than not, they always assume that he's the veteran. So of course, he would like to see more male caregivers become visible and supported.
Yeah.
They just automatically assume he's the veteran.
I will say that if you look at the statistics around just caregiving in this country in general, men actually do quite a bit of caregiving, almost half of the caregiving in this country. And so if we look at and this is what I'm going to do next. This is my seatbelt thing. That you know, VA in large part cares for older men. And a significant number of those men are caring for their wives who are non-veterans. And so if we want to be serious about family caregiving and supporting family caregivers, we need to be asking questions of those veterans, things like, you know, are you caring for your wife? And talk about the kinds of stress that you faced in those primary care appointments. So someday we'll get there.
Okay, we have time for another question if anybody has one. We've got one in the back.
I realize that you can't really speak to this personally, but what about challenges that parent caregivers face?
So I can talk a little bit about that. So the parents, so there's one piece is similar to the different generations piece as well, is that parents aren't eligible for a lot of things at this point on the DoD side. So if a veteran is seriously injured and medically retired from the military, their dependents are allowed to have TRICARE, which is health insurance. So their spouses and their kids have health insurance, but parents are not eligible for TRICARE. So I've worked with many parents where one of them has had to quit work, and in some cases, both of them have had to quit work because they're aging and they're facing their own challenges as well, and they're not eligible for health insurance. So that's one of the reasons why the post 9/11 program that I talked about does offer health insurance, but that's a huge challenge. And then the second piece is similar to what Robyn just talked about with Jason, is sort of they have a different tribe. And it's hard for them to relate to, spouses. There's a different role challenge. Issues that going from being a spouse to a spouse and a caregiver is a little bit different than going from a parent of an adult and then sort of having to parent them again. And I know some parents I've talked to have talked about how hard it is for them to sort of allow their children to be independent again. Like they already launched them, and now they're having to relaunch them, and how really challenging that is. And I know one fellow has a son who lives in an apartment by himself, and she is constantly terrified about him living in that apartment by himself, but still knows that she needs to let him be as independent as he can be.
And I know I can give a particular example. We were in an intensive treatment program, and the other family unit there was a mom and her son. And we still to this day talk, try to talk weekly or monthly if possible. And when you're done with the process, you take a questionnaire. And then 3 months later, you take a questionnaire, and a year later, and 6 months, it's this ongoing thing. But the questionnaire, she and I were laughing and talking about it because the questionnaire was not even built for her at all. The questions were about sexual activity. And it's like, how am I supposed to answer this? And she called them up and asked them, and they didn't know what to say. And this is a well-established, research facility that had no idea. And by the 3 month, they still had the same questions. And she still said, you're not getting good research from me because I can't answer these. And 6 months, it took a year to get them in play on that, I guess. So those are real challenges, both for that, caregiver, but also for the community that that we were working with.
Okay, any other questions? Time for one last question. Okay, I want to thank all three of you for all that you do and for an extraordinary discussion this afternoon. So thank you very, very much. And I want to thank all of you for coming out to our program, and hope to see you Thursday night when we have the inaugural Ed Riley lecture on bipartisanship and civility in politics. Thank you.